Calvin Reese was 37 years old the morning his wife looked across the breakfast table, set down her coffee mug, and told him he was the most useless man she had ever known. He was wearing his work clothes. He had been up since 5. He had already replaced the cracked tile on the back porch, serviced both vehicles, and packed his own lunch because she had stopped doing that 8 months ago and he had never mentioned it. He looked at her for a moment. Then, he picked up his keys and walked out. Her name was Sasha. She had been saying variations of that sentence for nearly 2 years, quietly at first, then openly, then in front of her friends, then in front of his mother on a Sunday that Calvin would not soon forget. She had a picture in her mind of who her husband was, and in that picture he was a man who drove a 10-year-old Dodge Ram, worked as a facilities coordinator for a mid-sized company in Nashville, and had no ambitions that threatened to interrupt her own. She was not entirely wrong about the truck. What she had never done, not once in 7 years, was ask him what he did before Nashville. She had never asked about the consulting firm. She had never asked about the federal contracts. She had never asked why. 3 days after she had him removed from the marital home by filing a temporary protective order built on a list of exaggerations that would unravel the moment a judge read them carefully. 12 black SUVs pulled up in a slow, unhurried line on the street in front of the house she believed was hers. She had told her attorney the marriage was worth $180,000. She was off by roughly $6.4 million. What happened in the days that followed would reconfigure everything Sasha Reese believed she had planned. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light came through the blinds of Calvin's temporary apartment in thin parallel lines and fell across the kitchen table where he sat with a cup of coffee, and the kind of silence a man learns to appreciate only after it has been taken from him for a while. He had been in the apartment for 11 days. He had brought 3 bags, his laptop, and a framed photograph of his mother that he set on the windowsill the first night, because she had told him once that a man who forgets where he came from is a man with no foundation to stand on. She was gone now, 4 years since, but he kept the photograph everywhere he lived because it was the closest thing to a compass he had. Calvin ran a logistics and operations consulting firm out of an office suite in Brentwood that Sasha had never visited. He had incorporated it 6 years before they met, grown it through federal infrastructure contracts and private sector clients, and by the time he married Sasha at 30, he had already cleared his first $1 million in annual revenue. He had a staff of 11. He had a financial manager named Curtis who handled his investment accounts. He had a separate phone for work, which he kept in his truck, and which Sasha had never thought to ask about because she had constructed a version of her husband in her mind and had never seen reason to revise it. He let her keep that version. He had always found it useful to be underestimated. His mother had taught him that. His mother, Irene, had raised him in a 3-bedroom house in North Nashville on a teacher's salary and a refusal to let any of her 4 children believe that the neighborhood they came from determined the lives they were capable of building. She had worked double shifts on the weekends for 11 years to keep that house, and she had sent Calvin to a summer engineering program when he was 14 that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. He remembered the morning he left for that program, his first time away from home, and how she had pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand at the bus station that read, in her careful teacher's handwriting, "Competence is quiet. Results are loud." He kept that paper in his wallet. He had met Sasha at a charity dinner for a housing initiative 6 years ago. She was in event marketing then, beautiful and sharp, and certain of herself in a way he found magnetic. He had liked her ambition. He had liked her laugh. He had told her he worked in logistics, which was accurate, and she had filed that information under unremarkable. and never returned to it. They were married the following spring. For the first 3 years it had been good. For the next 2, it had been manageable. In the 6th year, Sasha began to treat her dissatisfaction as a fact about Calvin rather than a condition she had any part in creating. The word useless entered her vocabulary sometime around the 5th year, and by the 7th it had become reflexive. He was useless. He was boring. He had no vision. Her friends' husbands were building things, doing things, becoming things. Calvin, she implied, was standing still. He was not standing still, but he was quiet. And quiet was easy to mistake for inertia. He noticed the change in her phone habits first. Then, the late arrivals. Then the way she stopped asking about his day, not with the indifference of familiarity, but with the pointed disinterest of someone who had already redirected their emotional investment elsewhere. He filed those observations the same way he filed everything, methodically, without reaction. Then she filed the protective order. He read it on a Tuesday afternoon standing in the parking lot of his office building and felt something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief exactly. It was the particular cold clarity of a man who has just been handed the final piece of information he needed. He called Curtis first. Then he called his attorney. His attorney was a woman named Lenora Baptiste, who had been practicing family law in Nashville for 26 years, and who, upon receiving the protective order and reading it from top to bottom, looked at Calvin across her desk and said, "These claims are thin. Thin enough that I want them in front of a judge before she has time to amend them." Calvin told her to proceed at whatever pace served the outcome. "Before I do," Lenora said, "I need the full financial picture." Everything. He gave it to her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, with the measured calm of someone who had learned not to show surprise in professional settings, "She doesn't know any of this." "No," Calvin said. "Does she know about the Brentwood office?" "She thinks I work from home." Lenora set down her pen. "Calvin, her attorney is about to walk into a negotiation with a number that is approximately $6 million short of the real figure. When that comes out, and it will come out in discovery, she is going to be in a very difficult position." "I know," he said. "How do you want to handle that?" "Correctly," he said. Real power operated in quiet rooms. His mother had understood that instinctively. Calvin had spent 15 years learning to put it into practice. He was not in the Brentwood office the following Thursday when his operations manager ran the quarterly review. He was at a diner in East Nashville with his uncle Raymond, who was 68 years old and had been Calvin's closest advisor since Irene passed, and who received the full account of the protective order and the impending divorce proceedings with the expressionless steadiness of a man who had survived enough to know that most crises were manageable if you did not panic. When Calvin finished, Raymond drank his coffee. Then he said, "You know what your mother would say. She'd say I should have handled this 2 years ago. She'd say that." Raymond set down the mug. "She'd also say that a man who reacts before he's ready hands his opponent the first advantage. You were getting ready. That's not weakness, that's strategy." Calvin nodded. "The SUVs," Raymond said. "That's for her or for the record?" "Both," Calvin said. Raymond permitted himself a small smile. "Your mother would have liked that." Over the following 10 days, Lenora and her associate compiled the full asset disclosure, the consulting firm, valued at $3.1 million by an independent assessor. The investment portfolio managed by Curtis, currently at $2 million, 2 commercial properties held in the firm's name in Murfreesboro and Smyrna, and the marital home, which was the only asset Sasha's attorney had included in her initial filing. The forensic accountant Lenora retained found something else. Over 22 months, Sasha had been making purchases, clothing, travel, 2 pieces of jewelry. On a supplemental credit card attached to the joint account, purchases she had categorized to Calvin as professional expenses. The total was $31,400. Some of it, the accountant noted, corresponded to travel dates that Calvin's own calendar confirmed he had been out of state. Calvin did not pursue it separately. He simply gave it to Lenora and told her to fold it into the disclosure package. He went home that Friday, the temporary apartment, not the marital home, and he sat at the kitchen table with the framed photograph of his mother and worked through the contract renewals his operations manager had sent over. The federal account alone was up for a $1.8 million renewal in the spring. He reviewed the language, suggested 3 revisions, and sent it back before 9 o'clock. He ate a bowl of soup. He went to sleep. Some things you only needed to do once, but you needed to do them exactly right. The arrangement had been Calvin's idea, and Lenora had agreed it was effective. Sasha's attorney had requested a settlement conference, believing she was negotiating over a marital estate of approximately $180,000. Lenora had scheduled it for a Friday morning at a neutral conference facility in Midtown, a suite of rooms used by mediation firms and legal teams that required a certain kind of address to make the right impression. Calvin arrived first. He had dressed simply, dark slacks, a gray wool jacket, the kind of clothes that did not announce themselves. Lenora was beside him. Curtis sat to his left. His real estate attorney, a tall, precise man named Gerald who did not speak unnecessarily, sat at the far end of the table. They had been in the room for 4 minutes when Sasha's attorney, a man named Drucker, came through the door with Sasha beside him. Sasha looked at the table. She looked at the people at the table. Her expression moved through a sequence Calvin watched with the detached attention of someone observing weather. She had not expected this room. She had not expected these people. She sat down across from Calvin and said nothing. Drucker opened by presenting his client's position: the marital home, a split of the joint account, and a spousal support arrangement based on the income disparity he had calculated from the tax returns Calvin had filed jointly. Returns that reflected his salary from the consulting firm as a modest distribution, the rest retained in the business. Drucker finished and looked at Lenora. Lenora said, "Thank you. Before we respond to the proposal, I'd like to introduce the full asset disclosure, which we are required by law to provide at this stage." She set a bound document in front of Drucker and a second copy in front of Sasha. She walked through it without hurrying. The consulting firm, the portfolio, the properties, the assessments, the total. Drucker turned pages. He stopped on page 4. He turned back to page 3. He read something a second time. Sasha was looking at the document, but her eyes had stopped moving. "I'd also like to address the protective order," Lenora said, "which we will be contesting in full. The supporting claims are documented as factually unsupported on pages 19 through 23. We have affidavits from 3 witnesses who were present at each of the cited incidents and whose accounts directly contradict the filing." Drucker closed the document. He looked at his client. Something passed between them that Calvin did not try to read. "I'll also note," Lenora said, "that the supplemental account expenditures, page 31, will be part of the equitable distribution calculation unless your client prefers to address them separately." Sasha looked up. She looked at Calvin. Calvin met her eyes. He did not look away, and he did not speak, and he did not lean forward. He simply let the silence exist. "You should have asked," he said finally. His voice was level and unhurried. 7 years. "You never asked." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and nodded to Lenora. He picked up the single folder that was his and walked to the door. Behind him, through the glass panel, he caught the movement of 12 vehicles pulling up to the curb in a slow procession. The security detail that accompanied his federal contract liaisons, who were meeting him downstairs in 20 minutes for a site debrief on the Smyrna project. He had not arranged them for effect. They simply arrived. When he had somewhere to be, he did not look back to see Sasha's expression when they pulled up. He didn't need to. 9 months moved through Calvin's life the way productive seasons do, not dramatically, but with a visible accumulation of result. The protective order was dismissed in its entirety at the first hearing. The judge's written ruling noted that the supporting documentation was insufficient to meet the required legal threshold, and that the claims appeared to have been filed in anticipation of divorce proceedings rather than out of genuine concern. Drucker withdrew from the case 10 days later. The settlement that Sasha eventually signed, through new counsel, gave her the marital home, which Calvin had agreed to relinquish without contest, the joint account balance, and the joint vehicle. The consulting firm, the portfolio, the properties, and the federal contracts were classified as separate property and remained untouched. The supplemental account expenditures were set off against her share of the joint account. She had walked into the process expecting $180,000. She walked out with the house and $14,000. Calvin heard, through Raymond's network of long-standing acquaintances, that Sasha had listed the house within 4 months. The carrying costs without a second income were more than she had anticipated. He heard that she had returned to event coordination work, freelance, after her marketing director position ended during a company restructure. He heard that 2 of the friends who had listened to her characterize Calvin as useless for the better part of 2 years had grown quiet on the subject. He registered all of it with the same neutrality he brought to any closing report. Noted, filed, complete, in the spring, the federal contract renewed at $2.1 million. Calvin took his team to dinner at a restaurant in the Gulch to mark it, and said very little beyond thank you, because the work had spoken for itself, and he had never believed in decorating results with words they didn't need. There was a woman named Diane who joined the firm that April as a senior operations analyst. She was precise and direct and asked questions in meetings that nobody else had thought to ask. And when Calvin eventually told her, in the careful abbreviated way he had learned to tell things, about the previous year, she had been quiet for a moment, and then said, "It sounds like she was looking at the surface and calling it a complete picture." He told her that was the most accurate description he had heard. He renovated the kitchen of the East Nashville house he had purchased after vacating the marital home, a craftsman bungalow 2 streets from where his mother had raised him, which he had found on a drive he took without any destination in mind. He refinished the hardwood floors himself over a long weekend in February, the same way he had always done work that mattered, slowly and without shortcuts, with the radio on low and no particular urgency. He hung the framed photograph of Irene in the hallway where the morning light found it first. On a Saturday in October, Calvin sat on the back porch he had rebuilt from new lumber and watched the yard go gold in the early evening. The tools were put away. The work was done for the day. The city made its quiet peripheral sounds. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly where he had always been building toward. He was solvent. He was settled. He was free. Some men spent their whole lives proving they were not what someone had decided they were. Calvin had spent his building something true instead. That turned out to be the better use of the time. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.